So welcome to the studio, or welcome back to the studio. This video is all about watercolour. I used to be a little bit intimidated by watercolour. It's uncontrollable, unpredictable, and it just felt a little bit out of reach. Like only real watercolour experts, professional artists could paint something and make it really beautiful. But being the stubborn creative rebel that I am, I decided to give myself 6 months to really explore, experiment and play and see what it actually does. And what I actually discovered completely changed how I paint and, more importantly, how I feel when I'm painting. So in this video I want to share my most unexpected, helpful watercolour hacks I've learnt, the ones that have actually made it feel joyful and intuitive and way more accessible than I possibly ever imagined. So if watercolour has ever felt intimidating, then I promise you this will open a few doors.
We're all building bridges slowly, tearing them down fast to start over. We're all trying to come over memories of the past and start over.
So let's start with some warm-up activities and some play. Some of the things that I suggest anyway. And I really like these little tins. These are by Hanamoule, or Hanamoule, however you pronounce it. This is a round watercolour paper, which is rather fun. This was actually gifted to me by my sister, and so was this one. So little postcard ones. Now the paper is quite textured, which is pretty similar, if not the same paper that's in the Hanamoule sketchbooks. These sketchbooks are a nice size for me to work with. I was looking for something that was portrait format rather than landscape. A lot of the watercolour books are actually landscape, so they open up that way rather than that way. So, you know, pick the way you like to work. And I tend to have little scraps of watercolour paper just to dab and play and test how thick or thin the paint is, just to make sure, you know, you get it how you want it. So have a few little bits and bobs of paper around you as well. And you can either warm up on there or warm up in a sketchbook. So the other sketchbook I've got that I like to use is this one by Fox and Willow. So I'm not sure you can get this on Amazon in the US at the moment, so you'll have to let me know in the comments, but I got this from Amazon. And again, I went for it because it was, you know, a portrait format, and I really enjoy doing faces and figures in here. So that's what I went for. But I mean, you can go with anything that you would like. So I'm just going to turn a fresh page, move my palette a little bit more that way so you can see. These are mostly Meaden watercolours. The other watercolours that my go-tos are my Daniel Smith palette, like that. That's what I'm going to be using today, a mixture of those. I like to have 2 containers of water to try and keep my water as clean as possible, so that my colours stay true and pure. And, you know, sometimes I clean up the mud that's left on my palette, sometimes I don't. I think I'm going to clean up a little bit. Big honest disclaimer here, I am no professional watercolour artist. I simply approach watercolour like I do any other media. As a mixed media artist, I love to play with different things, and I know I'm not the only one to be kind of put off by, you know, what they say about watercolour being, you know, really unforgiving, one of the most complicated, if not the most complicated media to actually master. But, you know, don't be put off by any of that. I want us to feel really welcome to play, you know, do blobs and different experiments, all the things you can do with watercolours, you know, really have a play, get a few things right, get a few things wrong, learn as you go along. And that's basically what I've been doing in this sketchbook. So for me, this sketchbook is just a playground for me to just do things, experiment, things that are maybe a little bit out of my comfort zone. Things that, you know, maybe colour palettes that work for me and colour palettes that don't work for me. Some things that have gone really, really well, and some things that perhaps, you know, haven't gone so well. I kind of did 2 versions of the same source material here, just to see with the different colour palettes and the different mood would change things. And so, you know, I'm finding my own way with watercolour. I've definitely found a few things that I really like, and I definitely know that it's really helpful to try and stay loose. You know, when you're gripping your brush for dear life, try and stay loose with your tools and move your body a little bit, your wrists, do your hands. And so I think warm-ups is probably the most important thing we do as artists. So without further ado, let's start with a few warm-ups then. So I'm going to grab a medium-sized brush. This one is Princeton Neptune round number 12. Wet my brush, dip it in some of these reds over here, a little bit of a crimson. You can start just by, working straight onto paper, onto dry paper like this. Or you can just clean my brush here. Start by doing a wet patch where you want the watercolor to go, and then add in your pigment into that. You can drop it in, you can smush it in. So straight away we've got two different things that we can do with watercolor. One of the most important things I've learned about watercolor in my playtime has been, the subtleties are very important. That's what I've found. And it's really taught me patience. Less contrast, basically, is what I've been practicing. Because I'm quite a bold artist. I like to go in quite strong, quite bold. But at the same time, I really do appreciate those subtle layers as well. I mean, already you can see the subtle differences, but just approaching it with this in two different ways. So while that's still wet, we can add in other colors. We can add in, maybe let's put in a little bit of purple, just mixing a quick purple here. And we can, drop that into the wet areas on both. We can smush it about if we want to, blend it in or not blend it in, blend part of it in. I like to put some layers down. So for example, you can put a line down as we did over here, just straight onto dry paper, and then clean my brush and just have water on it, and then just touch the edge of that. And then if you want to have some stronger pigment, one end, you can drop it in. I'm thinking, we're graduating with our tonal values a little bit. So that's really fun to play with. So I'm just putting down some paint here, and then all I'm going to do on this little example is I'm just going to drop some plain water just straight into this wet paint to see what happens. And there we can see kind of the blooms. Just zoom in a little bit for you there so you can see a bit better. The drops of water are repelling, are pushing the paint away. And another way you can do that, just grab a little bit more paint. Let's do a little bit of a patch here, lots of that lovely purple. And then here I'm just going to drop a little bit of the alcohol in there. I'm just going to grab a paintbrush. Just going to literally, you can see there, that's repelling that much more dramatically than the water. But there's subtlety to that one that you might want in certain effects. At the same time, we can use a spray gun, simple. And just spray some water in there. And again, you can see that where the plain water repels. And you can do things the other way around as well. So I can just perhaps spray a little bit on the page and then drop some paint straight down into the drops just to see what happens. So let's talk about blooms for a minute, shall we? So we just put some paint down. I'm going to put quite a lot of pigment down in this little sample, so it's not as watery, shall we say. And then what I'm going to do on my palette, I'm just going to take you over to my palette so you can see. I'm going to add in some water to this mix. Now this is what they say not to do, because you get something called a bloom. So if I start adding in a more watery layer to that, an effect, the watery layer next to, the heavier pigment that I put down, I'm going to grab a little bit more purple and really water that down and see if I can do over here as well. I want you to really have a play with different dilutions of paint over the top. So I want you to start off with, layers that were really, really thick, and then get some watery paint, really, really watery paint, and see, that's had a little bit of time to dry. See what happens when you touch things next to each other and what kind of effects you get. The basic rule with watercolor, let's just zoom out a little bit as well, is to start light. So you would traditionally start with really watery layers, and then you can either work over the top of that with something a little bit less watery into the mix, and you won't get these kind of effects, these kind of blooms that we've got forming on this one as well. You'll see in a minute. So I can go in with more paint over the top while it's still wet. I'm not talking about when we wait for layers to dry. At this point I'm still talking that we're working on the first layers really wet. You can see here, I just lift the pad up a little bit, we're getting some unsmooth blending going on. Where here, where I did the light paint and then the dark paint, we'll get a much better, we won't get all these kind of blooms situation. So that is a traditional way of doing it. You'll start with really light watery layers like that, and then as you go over the top with wet layers, you have a little bit more opacity into the mix, a little bit more pigment into the mix, and then a little bit blue in that one as well. Let's just add a little bit more pigment. It gets thicker, less watery as you go along, until you're basically using pretty much pure pigment and just a damp brush, and you've got different mixes, and so you go from one to the other. But if you're like me and you like to experiment, then I like to know about all these kind of different outcomes. And sometimes, as Bob Ross would say, happy accidents are really helpful, because it teaches you things. It teaches you, I'd really like that effect. That would work really well for snow, or some florals in the distance, or maybe some underwater scenes. It might work really, really well. So for example, I used, in my recent painting, let's just move that to the side for a minute, I used a lot of these techniques that I'd learned from having a play in this painting. And so you can see here I've got, my blooms and different ghosting techniques. There's different things I splattered and sprinkled. I used putting pure water on to make it disappear and repel the paint. I didn't use alcohol on this one, but you can see, I've got quite a few blooms going on, which I left. I didn't work, I let them dry, and then I worked over the top. So, there are occasions, I know it's maybe an unpopular opinion about blooms, and cauliflowers is another word people use for them, but I really love them, and I really love the surprising and unexpected effects that you get with watercolour that you can't get with any other medium. And so that's why watercolour for me is such a beautiful, expressive medium to work with, and it goes side by side with all my sort of artist therapy and art for healing, because it's so expressive and so wonderful, but only if we let watercolour do what watercolour does. The clue is in the title again, water moves, water is fluid. So if we let it do its thing, then we can really use that later on in our artwork as well. We can go back to our playgrounds and our experiments. You can make notes on these and say, this is the one that I did this with, and so this was the alcohol, wasn't it, here, and this one was the water drops, this one was the water spray, this one was when we were using light to dark, which is the traditional way, and you can see how smooth that dried, the light to dark one. Smooth transitions rather than all these blobby effects. So I think it's really important to get to know your materials like this. Just like children, we learn through play too. So call it warm-up, call it playtime, call it science lab, call it experiments, but try and do all the things you can do with watercolour. I mean, I've got some salt in the studio as well. Sometimes I just put salt on it, and then when that dries, you can see, it's going to absorb moisture. So, and then you can peel it off, and I'll show you that once that's dried as well. Sometimes things like this are just a little bit more interesting. You can see here where the bloom's going here, this uneven blending that we're supposed to be avoiding. But there are times where it's just, it can be a little bit more interesting. And after you've done a page like this, you can come in with a micron pen, you can doodle over the top of things, you can make things, as you're seeing things, maybe these are going to be faces or flowers. You can have a little play with that and then go over with a different layer of colour as well. So if you're worrying about, wasting pages in your sketchbook, then it's not wasting it. It's exploring, it's experimenting, it's playing, and it's learning. Most important, it's how we learn. So never feel like you're wasting paper by doing things like this. And if you really can't cope doing it in your sketchbook, get some loose little bits and bobs and have a play on those as well. So let's talk about a few basics then, just really quickly. We've kind of covered a few bits and bobs here. I think the most important basic, if we're talking about doing things traditionally, is to use what we did here. So where we go really, really watery, and we can go, in fact, let's change colour here. Let's make it a bit more interesting. Let's go head towards the blue greens. I've also swapped brush here. I'm just using a number 6 Rosemary and K Kolinsky Sable, and this is series 22. This is quite a nice soft brush to use. So let's water that down even more. And let's go really, really gentle with our layers. So traditionally speaking, you work light to dark, and any whites, super highlights, you leave the paper blank. So in that sense, even a really subtle layer like this is going to be really important. And this is where I've learned patience and subtlety, where normally I'd want to go down with something a little bit heavier like that. I mean, you can have, you know, something even lighter. You know, if you're doing subtleties in the sky or subtleties in flowers, you can go even lighter than that. And that can be your first layer. And it's almost not even colouring the paper. But then, you know, you go over the next layer. And so in this sense, you're not adding white into your palette at all. I mean, you can use white gouache, white acrylic over the top of things, and then you can build in highlights afterwards if you lose some. You can also use masking fluid. I've got 2 that I really like here. They're both actually by the Schminker company. Not sponsored or affiliated, unfortunately. Yeah, one's just a white, and then this one is a coloured one, because I was finding the little pen nib here quite useful. But then when I was putting the blue down, say in the little spaces on the nose or the dots in the eyes, that I wanted to retain the white paper, I was struggling a bit because the blue was distracting me. So this one is actually a clear one, so you don't really see it. Yeah, I apply it with a little brush and it really helps. You have to think about which parts of the paper you want to keep white. So for this one, for example, you can see I've left some of it's just naked paper. And I strategically think about that as I'm painting, if that makes sense. And I have actually gone over with some white gouache on this one. The whole tutorial of this painting is actually on my Patreon as well, if anyone's interested. I have a whole series of watercolour videos on there, as well as art journaling and all my other videos as well. Anyway, so let's go in with a little bit more paint now then. So I can go over this, more pigment. And as you can see, as it's drying lighter. So you have to remember that about watercolour as well. And I'm just going to go over, like overlap, as if I was doing layers of tissue paper. That's kind of how I think about it. I really love, and if you've been here a little while, you will know, I love the artwork of Eric Carle, who wrote, among other things, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, and the way that he used tissue paper in his collage layers. I absolutely love that. So while that's still wet, I can add even more pigment, and it's not going to cause me a bloom. I'm going to get, you know, much smoother transitions. This also depends on what paper you've got as well. So this is a cold press paper. I've also really love using this paper, which is a hot press. So this is a little bit more difficult to work on, but I really, really enjoy the hot press paper. This is done on the hot press paper, and it's, yeah, quite difficult to control, which is something I really, really love. Just to let the watercolour do its thing. So I can drop paint into that while it's still wet, because I'm adding more pigment rather than water. If I add water into that mix, I'm going to start to get some of these bloomy effects that I've got over here. And then you can choose whether to let your paint dry between each layer, or whether you want to just keep adding heavier pigment over the top. And as long as you're adding more pigment into the mix instead of adding the watery layers, really, really strong at the end, you can build up your paintings with nice smooth transitions between your tonal values, if that makes sense. Another thing that you can do actually, which I could have shown on this page, is to use different tools. So you can drag, you know, you can get some really fine lines into here, drag it into through the paint. It could be some kind of plant life, some kind of trees. So definitely think about different tools as well. You know, things like old credit cards. I have a stack of cards that I keep in the studio. There's an old library card there, and you know, so that I can make marks where I want to. Maybe that comes, you know, more on this side. So I think it's safe to say then water ratio really matters, and retaining white paper. I think the other thing I'll say here as well is I can't stress that one enough. Instead of thinking, oh, I'm not good enough yet to use my good paper, think I'm going to learn faster if I use my good paper. And some of it's really, really expensive, but you can get more budget options as well. I really like using Strathmore mixed media paper as well. This one, I can use inks on here, watercolors on here. It's really wonderful for watercolors, I have to say. I can vouch for that paper. I've been using it for decades, literally. In fact, it's the paper I took traveling with me when we sold our house and moved into a van and went traveling for several years around Europe. So there's a whole load of videos about that if you're interested in that. But that was the paper I took with me. It sustained me for years, where I didn't want to bring canvases because it would have taken up too much space. And I still love it, and I still dip into it regularly even today. The other joy about using your best paper is you can do something called the lifting technique. So you wet and dry your brush. So I've got a nice clean brush here, drying it on a bit of kitchen roll, and then you can lift depending on the paper. Let me just zoom you in a little bit and you can see that a bit better, but you can see that is actually lifting that paint up, even though it was dry, or I would say it was almost dry. But on a good paper you can lift like that to get some of the light back, even when the paint's dry, properly dry. So that really is a good paper test if you can do that, of a good paper. So this is 100% cotton, this one's 100% cotton, kind of quite a heavy paper, so a 300, 140 pound. The cotton element is key, and it also really helps with longevity for your paintings as well, so archival qualities. So if you're selling your work, you're assured that, you know, your paints are not going to just fade, even though probably most watercolor paintings anyway are going to be put behind glass. You know, they will have an element of fade. A lot of the pinky purple florally colours, shall I say, some of those are not as archival as the rest of our palette, so you need to look those up. But again, you know, getting a good quality paint, this one by Daniel Smith, decent quality paint and a decent quality paper is really important. So I'm going to add that to the list as well. So we've got good paper lifting ability, we'll call it. It also varies pigment to pigment. So some pigments soak into the paper much more and they're much harder to lift. So again, this is where your playground comes in, where you experiment with your colours, swatch your colours out, see which ones lift and which ones don't. Keep notes as well, that's always really important, because if you're anything like me, you forget things. I love to have a playtime regularly, whether I use my medium a lot or not, because there's always new things to learn. And I'll put decent paints. And I have to say the Meadens are very decent. I have this is not a sponsored or affiliated video, by the way, but they did send me these freebies, and I have done a previous sponsorship with them. This palette is from them as well, actually, and I do recommend them. They are student grade quality. They're not professional grade, but they're great for sketchbooks, and there's some, you know, really nice colors, and they're pretty affordable as well, so I really like those. The other sets that I recommend that are really, really budget, which I think these cost about £5 or £6 English, are these by Koh E Noor, and they're really, really fab for going out plein air, because you get a little palette, different layers, there's different sets of them as well. I think this one is my favorite. You can kind of see I've used a lot of the paint in this one. I've used a lot of the paint in this one as well, so this is really old. I love these, and these are very potent pigments as well. They're almost like the Kuriati Japanese watercolors as well, so a little bit like a cross between watercolor and ink. Let's just get rid of the dust there. So just to start here, yes, start subtle. Water ratio matters, paper matters, retaining the white of the paper matters. Use masking fluid if you want. Have a go with masking fluid, see if it helps you. Definitely keep experimenting. So let's have a play with an actual something then, whether you want to doodle a flower or a face. I just sometimes like to do things in pencil, lift up any of the heavy pencil you you know, want to get rid of before you put your watercolour layers down. And then you've got your basic positions of things, if you like, if you don't want to start like I did on this one. So this one, no pencil underneath. This is really experimental, where I had my book standing up and just let it drip. This one slightly less so, but you know, some of them are no pencil. And then, you know, when I began, I did little pencil sketches underneath. I'm not sure about that one. I think there might have been, actually. Can't fully remember. If you can see here, this is with pencil. So, you know, shake it up a bit, mix it up a bit, however you want it. I've just put these underneath so that I can just prop my book up a little bit to help let the watercolour run. Anyway, let's have a little go at what we've learnt. See if we can do a little bit of a face in the corner. Yes. So I've just let that layer dry. I thought I could come in and just take off the salt. So you just sort of rub it off. Yeah, you can see what kind of effects the salt does. Quite nice for landscapes, that kind of thing. Anyway, apart from this lovely quinacridone gold, I'm going to stick, I think, to the colours that we've been using on here just for fun. We talk about finishing, you know, paintings, like, you know, if we're doing a final piece, but we don't talk about finishing little things in our sketchbooks. And there is a difference, and sometimes we push things further and sometimes we leave things, you know, in a state of unfinished. I've kind of gone quite far with a few details here and there, definitely having a little play with the effects and things we've been talking about. Sometimes I grab my square brush and I go in maybe with something, you know, a shadow where I need it. So maybe underneath, I'm just going to grab a little pencil crayon as well, just to kind of work out where that jawline is, because I think I've lost it somewhere. So I might just sort of work on putting a shadow somewhere just to suggest the jawline again. I think there needs to be a little bit of shadow once that eye has dried, and I want to use this kind of grey colour, really water it down, dry my brush, and just go over the eye. Too much whites of the eyes is never a good thing, because they're not white. I might do a bit more shadow there. See where you want to just define bits and bobs, but you know, I think I'm going to just leave it. I love the elements of unfinished pages. I absolutely love that. This hasn't dried yet, so I can't sort of show you, but it's more this one here in a state of unfinished, which I showed you earlier. I might just add a little bit to the hair. you know, like we said right at the beginning, watercolor is going to dry lighter. So if you want to, you can just strengthen up here and there at the end. Anyway, that is, you know, a few of our play and basics in action in the shape of a face. Even if faces aren't really your thing, I really recommend having a play with faces. They can be quite challenging, but fun. So, you know, go to town. And, you know, you can always close the book and you don't have to show anybody your sketchbook ever anyway. So that's the perfect thing about sketchbook play. So I think to sum it all up, the 5 best things that I wish I knew about watercolor before I started, in a way, the things that maybe have surprised me above and beyond the kind of basic stuff, would be paper. Use your best paper. Number 2, all about the subtle layers. Really matter. I mean, even in the face you can see the subtle layers coming through are, you know, they make it have form, they make it have interest, they make it have that roundness in places. So number 3, I think my most favorite thing that I've learned about watercolor is to let it do its thing. Really let it do its thing. For example, you know, we come back to this painting again. I really just love letting it do its thing, letting it flow, not worrying too much. I mean, you saw on here, you know, I just let it do its thing. It's so fun. There are effects that you will get by letting watercolor just do its thing that you couldn't paint. You literally couldn't paint them if you tried. Be brave, have faith. Know that you're not going to love everything, and that's okay, and just go for it. Ask yourself, what happens if I do that? What happens if I do the other? What will happen if I turn the book upside down? What will happen if I work with my book propped up? What will happen if I add this colour to this colour while it's all still wet? What will happen if I use a marking tool like a credit card or a palette knife? What will happen if I use a different brush or I use a thicker paint? All those things, just ask yourself these questions all the time and stay curious about what it's actually going to do, because with watercolor it's about a certain element of control. So yes, you do have a certain element of control. We can wipe things off, we can, you know, control certain things, but we have to let go. The 4th thing that I've learned about watercolor, which was really surprising, was the fact that I've learned patience. So I really have learned to go slower and use these starting layers, the subtle layers, maybe not so much in this one, but certainly, you know, in my previous ones, where I've really gone really soft and subtle, and I've achieved outcomes that I never even thought I could do. I think this is my most favorite one, you know, so subtle, so soft. So coming back to this starting subtle and, you know, spending 3 or 4 or even 5 layers of staying subtle. For the next one, I think the other thing I've really learned about watercolor is to bust the myths. So any myths that you've been told about watercolor, you know, have a play and bust them. Because with the blooms, for example, it's one of my most favorite things to do. I absolutely love, and you can see with the water drops, these layers now, how it's bloomed into the other layer, because we put the more watery paint on top of a more opaque paint, so the ratio really matters. But I love knowing that and then creating that where I want it. I think the last little tip which I will give, which I don't think is talked about enough in any media for art, is to leave something 85 to 95% unfinished. Just leave it. Absolutely leave it, especially when it comes to sketchbooks, and then come back to it if you like, so you can have that percolation, that breathing time. Because there are so many times I have overworked something. So for example, in this little lady, I overworked so much the colours went muddy, and I do like elements of her, but the colours went muddy. I had to go back in with a white gouache, a white ink, and yeah, she just went flat and it wasn't the outcome I was looking for. I think I almost overworked this one, but she had a lot of contrast anyway. I was just okay with this one. That one was probably left more unfinished, and look at the luminous quality you get, the light, the paper coming through. So this was a really quick warm-up, but I really love the quality of her skin on here. And I could have gone more layers and I could have gone more detail, but I left it, and you know, I've got a record of that now, all soft and luminous. Overworked, in my opinion. You know, still elements I like about them, so it's not that I'm saying I don't like it, but Yeah, overworked. And because I'd overworked or felt that I'd overworked these, I went in soft on these ones. And this is where a sketchbook works so beautifully, because you've got a record of your progress and you can see what you like and what you don't like and what you've enjoyed and what you don't enjoy and all the mistakes that you've made that you've learned from and moved on. And you can have all that in one place so that you've got a record and you can come back to it. So for me as a mixed media artist, I love to use oils and acrylics and watercolors and pencils and inks, all the things. But say if I haven't been with watercolors for a while, I can come back to my sketchbook, flip through and say, I really loved certain elements of how I did this or how I did that, and have that in front of me as a visual prompt of, where I want my work to go. Anyway. So now let's move to something that, hopefully will inspire you to get started. I really want you to get your own paints out and have a go. So nothing has to be perfect. As you can see, I've had a little play just for today with this masking fluid. So I've just kind of done a little dot in the eye, little highlight around the nose and lip. I've got all my paints out, ready, a couple of buckets. I haven't cleaned my palette. I'm not about perfectionism. If you've been here a while, you will know. And I'm just going to lay down the first few layers, see what happens. So I'm still having a play, I'm still experimenting, I'm still going with kind of intuitive feel, but I'm also thinking about the quality of watercolor, what it does, how it behaves, mixing that in with how I want it to behave, as well as letting it do its own thing as well. Yes.
Down on the banks of the Old Man River, heavy air calling rain. They say if she keeps up and delivers, levee will break again. Tell me, what could you do then, when the river comes a-calling? Bend a knee and pray that you can stay in the good grace of the water. Storm, she's stalling and danced. Days of rain and wind, mist hanging in the valley. Victim of a circumstance. Try your hand at sand, but no, the banks ain't holding. Old Man River rising 3 foot by the hour. Drop your bags and run, surrender time has come to the water. High, still waves are lapping on the bridge down, seascaping in England town. Come on children, make a run for higher ground now. See the fire, hear the siren sound. Surely land will return here, choked up to its neck in yellow mud. From the mountain now we go by foot and march back down to the water. Trot on up and every single step it kicks up dust from the water.
So we know that watercolour will always have a mind of its own. That's part of its charm, part of its magic. But once we learn to dance with it rather than control it, something clicks. So whether you're just beginning or coming back to your practice after a long pause, I hope these tips gave you not just techniques, but a permission slip to create more freely. Art doesn't have to be perfect to be powerful. The creative joy is the masterpiece. So I really hope you enjoyed the video. And as always, thank you so much for keeping me company. Try to keep your lights shining as bright as you can. I will if you will. Keep painting with your whole heart. So bye for now, and I'll see you really soon in the next video. Bye for now. Bye.